Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity and understanding and identifying threats. Data protection in our business is imperative to ensure that we're protecting our patients' information and providing them the best care possible. So we're going to go over what threats and threat actors are and which one poses a threat to our company specifically. Threat actors are groups that could pose a threat to our company, and then the threats that the threat actors could utilize are also an important piece of information. We will discuss both and the attacks that they could utilize. This information is for knowledge purposes, so that way we can become more vigilant moving forward. Each of the threat actors can pose a different threat. We'll briefly go over the different threat actors first, and then we will get into the threats that they can pose. There are many different threat actors. However, the following are the ones that could directly affect our company. Cyber terrorists, cyber criminals, APTs, also known as advanced persistent threats, script kiddies, hacktivists, and insider threats. These are the most common and the ones that we could see in our business. Who's the biggest threat? So when looking at the 6 main threat actors, the most prevalent to risk for us would be cyber criminals and internal threats. These threat actors would risk accessing our patients' personal information. Cyber criminals would be able to utilize this data for malicious use. Internal threats could either be intentional or unintentional. Their primary goal, if intentional, would most likely be to hurt the individual, people that have harmed them, or hurt the organization as a whole. So now that we know what threat actors we have to look out for, we're going to get into the possible threats. There are several different threats that any of these threat actors could perform against the hospital. Some of these attacks include DDoS attacks, phishing attacks, malware attacks, SQL injection, man-in-the-middle attacks, DOS attacks, password cracking attacks, and buffer overflow attacks. And we're going to get into these a little bit further. So phishing attacks are a method of social manipulation where the attacker tries to convince the victim to divulge sensitive information such as usernames, passwords, or financial information. Password cracking attacks are when a user uses software to try to predict a password in order to gain access to a system. And man-in-the-middle attacks are when the attacker intercepts communications between two different victims and claims to be both of them. DDoS attacks involve flooding a network with traffic from several sources in order to make it inaccessible. Malware attacks are created with the intent to harm or impair a computer system. And SQL injection attacks are an attack where the attacker introduces malicious software into a database in order to obtain access to the sensitive information. DOS attacks are attacks that try to take down a system or applications by bombarding it with data or service requests. And lastly, buffer overflow attacks. These are an attempt to write more data to a memory location than is allotted to that location, which can lead to data corruption or even system crash. So now to understand, what is the difference between risk versus threat? A threat is an event that has the potential for impacting a valuable resource in a negative manner. A vulnerability is the quality of a resource or its environment that allows the threat to be realized. So an example of this is a person's information that they stored on their computer is a vulnerability because someone could access that information. The threat would be the possibility of someone being able to access and obtain their information. In order to mitigate the risk, they have their information only accessible by a VPN, which does not get rid of the threat, but it does help to mitigate the risk. So now we're going to go over the threat actors and the threat that they are most likely to perform. So now that we know each of the different 6 threat actors, we're going to discuss which threat they're most likely to perform so that we're all paying attention to that. Cyber criminals would most likely be performing a phishing attack. The phishing attack would be social manipulation in order to gain access to information because they want to do as much damage as possible, usually with a monetary gain for themselves. Internal actors, however, would most likely perform a malware attack. These threats are usually intentional and perform as acts of vengeance or being upset with the company. So they would use the malware with intent to harm the system itself. Cyber terrorists would most likely perform a buffer overflow attack. These attacks are the most serious because they can cause data corruption or even system crash. Cyber terrorists are normally looking to cause the most damage possible. The threat that APTs would most likely perform would be the DOS attack. The DOS attacks would try to take down the systems and applications by bombarding it with data or the service requests. These attacks would be consistent and not just a one-time occurrence. Threat hacktivists are most likely going to perform are the man-in-the-middle attacks. These attacks are in order to intercept communications, which hacktivists can use to release in order to support their causes. And lastly, script kiddies. They are most likely to perform password cracking attacks. Script kiddies do not generally have specific goals, but more just to attack and attempt to hack whenever possible. Password cracking attacks are one of the easier attacks that can be attempted, so they're a little more tempting for the script kiddies. So in closing, any one of these threats should be taken very seriously. There are definitely some that are more serious than others, specifically in our cases, the cyber criminals and the internal threats are our most 2 threats that we would be looking out for specifically. However, being aware of all the threat actors as well as the possible threats that could happen to our business could help us utilize methods in order to create prevention moving forward. Thank you.